All right, family. We're getting right back into it. We've been on this journey talking about building wealth. And what I like to say is the first pillar of building wealth is getting our home life straight and getting into home ownership, right? So we spent some time talking about what the importance of credit, how to build your credit. And now we're going to start legging into, okay, how do you really qualify for a home? All right, and maybe what we'll try to do, depending on where you live in the country, homes cost different amounts depending on how large your family is. Whether you want a swimming pool, do you want a white picket fence, do you want 2 stories, 1 story, do you want a condo? There's all different options out there. For round figures, I think what we'll do is we'll just use the number 300,000 as a potential home purchase price. Now, if you're up here in New York City, that's going to be tough to do. As you get further into the suburbs or other parts of the country, that may even be expensive. But we'll just use $300,000 just so as we're doing some math around this thing. I want to use something as kind of a table stakes to help us get oriented. So your credit needs to be straight. Just as a quick reminder, you want to get that credit if you can. You're really not buying anything north if your credit's not north of 620, and even at 620, you're going to be paying a premium and interest rate. So you really want to get to 700 plus, and if you can get to 740 plus, now you're considered, what the lenders would call excellent credit, and now you can get some of their better rates, best rates, and it just shows a pattern of paying your bills on time and not being late, not getting last day to go with how you pay. Setting that aside, you need, as you're approaching the home buying effort, you're going to need a down payment, right? Because lenders want to see you have what we'll call some skin in the game. They want to see you put some money down so that you now have put some risk at the table, and is less likely you will walk away from that house if times get hard. You're going to try and make sure you don't lose the money you put down. Now, normally, 20% down on a house you're going to live in. All right. Now, again, talking about $300,000 house, that's $60,000. That may be a lot, or maybe too much money for somebody to come up with. Now, what we talked about in the past, but I'm going to really go in on, is if you are buying a house and it's your first time house in the last 5 years, then you're considered a first time home buyer. And first time home buyer, you can qualify for what's called an FHA loan, Fair Housing Fair Housing Association loan, FHA loan, which is 3% down. So instead of putting $60,000 down, instead at 3%, you are able to put down only maybe $9,000, which is 3% of $300,000. So now you put $9,000 down. There will be some closing costs associated with buying the house, and then there's going to be an issue of, can you afford the payment? So if you have your 9,000, you go to a lender and say, listen, I've got my $9,000+. I'd like to buy a home. I'd like to transition from renting to buying, and secure some home ownership, which is the first pillar in building wealth. And we'll talk maybe a little bit about that. But at the end of the day, they're looking to make sure not only do you have skin in the game, but can you afford the payments? And so they're going to analyze all your cash flow, money coming in, where it's coming from, your salary, if you make some commission, if you make some tips, that's a sizable dollar amount. If maybe you have some money's coming in from, a former spouse who's paying you child support or alimony, things of that nature. All that stuff can count. When it comes to child support, alimony, if you are a recipient, you don't have to declare that stuff. You can opt not to. But if it helps you qualify for a home, why not? Include that, and now it helps you to get what's called the debt to income ratio down. And depending on the lender, they're going to have a range within which they feel comfortable extending a home loan to. Some lenders are more conservative. So they want to see you under 35% of your income is already allocated in a, to pay down debt. That includes credit cards. That includes, they're going to factor in what the future home loan would be. They're going to factor in a lot of different things, traditional just household expenses. They'll give an allocation for that. All right. But they want to keep you under 35% of your gross income, not your net income. So pre-tax income, under 35%. Yes, sir.
Let me ask you a quick question. So in a situation like that, does the rent you pay factor into that?
So two ways it will. One is, if you can demonstrate paid the listing rent for X number of months or years. I've never missed anything. They can check to make sure that nothing shows up on your credit that you have missed. That just shows that, hey, if I'm paying $2,000 a month or whatever it is, I've been able to handle that responsibility very well for who knows how long, and they'll be able to see that. So that's one way where it helps. But when it comes to qualifying, they know you're leaving the rent situation and you're picking up a mortgage situation. So they're not going to factor the 2,000, whatever that dollar amount is of rent as your debt to income ratio, because you're losing that in exchange for the mortgage. Does that answer your question, bro?
Yeah.
So my question is, where we at? We're in Brooklyn. In Brooklyn, they have a lot of 2 and 3 family homes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like these huge homes in the suburbs.
Yeah.
It can hold several families. So is that a thing now? Can we say, hey, I'm going to get rent from this apartment and that'll help me pay the mortgage? Will they look at that?
Yeah, bro. That's what they call that the house hacking, right? So, and if
Mhm.
I'm doing, if I, especially if I'm single, but even if you're a young couple and it's your first home forehead, that's the route I would go. I
Mhm.
would go the route of getting a duplex or a triplex, a two home apartment, or a two home house, or a three home house. And then what you do is you're renting out the other side or the other two units. You're living in the third if it's a 3 unit house, right? They can allow you to take 75% of the potential income of renting out the other sides and factor that into your income potential in order to
Mm.
qualify to buy all three of the triplex or two of the duplex. So they credit you some of that income, not all of it, but 75% of it. So let's use an example, right? Maybe it's a $900,000 property. There's 3 units. You're going to live in one. There's two other units, and each unit's renting for $2,000 a month. So now it's $4,000. They're going to give you three-quarters of that, $3,000 a month increase to your income, which is going to help you from a debt to income perspective be able to qualify to buy the entire thing and only live in one third of it. And then over time, you can increase those rents. And that means they're paying more and more of your mortgage, and your personal out of pocket expense to live there goes down over years. It's a
Mm.
great way to get into home ownership.
So if you are doing something like that where you're going to rent out part of the property or maybe a floor, and
Okay.
I know we're talking rough numbers, how much money do you suggest that a person have saved in case there's damage to the apartment or the tenant stops paying rent? Which I
Right,
know a
right,
lot of
right.
people that happen to.
Yeah, especially up here in the Northeast, because a lot of the
Yeah.
laws allow you to
Yeah.
do that. I
It
I would
leans
say
towards the tenant.
a great ballpark estimate is 6 months of what you would call principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, PITI. So basically, the mortgage, right? Most mortgages, you escrow your taxes and your insurance into the payment. So 6 months worth of mortgage. That's a lot of money for some people, right? I'm not going to lie about that. But the lender will want you to see that. And I would say it's prudent. Some lenders might say, hey, only 3 months. And you just got
Mm.
to show it to us. We don't care what happens to the money after you close. That's literally what they'll say, because they plan to sell the loan to another buyer anyway, but they want to see that you have it before you close. What I would tell you, to your point, Professor G, to keep you sleeping well at night and avoiding that financial disaster, is you got to just keep bulking up that savings account just in case of emergency. You may have a paying tenant who then leaves, but then when you walk into the unit they were renting, you find out they left it in it, it's damaged. There was 9 cats in there, and they had a flood they never told you about. There's mold everywhere, and now you got to go through and you got to do a bunch of repairs. And if you don't have that money handy to handle that and get that thing rented again, you have a
Done.
problem on your hands for sure.
Yes.
But
So see, I want to throw one more question at you before you
yes,
before
sir.
you go in. Um, can cash, if you have cash in hand, can that kind of mask some of this? So let's say, like you're saying, the house is 300,000. If I've got $250,000, but my credit score is 615, does that affect the loan
Yeah,
rates or anything
absolutely.
like that?
It does. It does. It does because it's all about risk and reward, right? So what ends up happening is um, the lender is putting up the risk. You're buying a house, but they're putting up 80 to 97% of the money for you to buy that house. It's a lot of risk. So if you came to them and said, hey, listen, my credit's shot, here's why. Okay, but now I've got money. and I'm willing to put up 50%. Maybe I'm willing to put up $150,000 on a $300,000 house. That's less risk for the lender. And if it's less risk for the lender, that'll affect, hopefully the interest rate should come down because of that. Hopefully the ability for them to accept you and give you an approval for that loan is gonna be a lot more accessible. Absolutely. But you lose some of the leverage opportunity, right? That's one of the coolest things. Let me just go into that real quick. $300,000 house, back to that scenario. You put down 3% FHA loan. You get into that house. You're in an area like Brooklyn or somewhere where houses appreciate in value year over year. And let's say 5 years later, that $300,000 house is now worth $420,000, which is not unrealistic. And while over those 5 years, you've been making your steady mortgage payments. And so now you stepped in owing $291,000 because you put down $9,000, and then you've been paying the mortgage down. And I don't have an amortization table in front of me, but let's say you owe after 5 years. Let's say you owe from 291, you're down to maybe 275. So you owe 275, but the house is now worth 420. And if you were to sell it, the 420 minus 275 is yours. And that's $155,000. Or correction, $145,000. That's a lot of money. And that's the wealth building that we as a people, and I'm talking about Black people now, had been redlined in the American society for a long time and kept away from property that had the ability to appreciate in value, or weren't able to qualify for certain loans for a lot of different reasons. And so we were kept out of that wealth building opportunity. So now when you look at the wealth gap today, the wealth gap is largely an impact of not being able to get into homes in nice areas that appreciate it in value and help those families to generate wealth, build wealth, leave that wealth to the next generation. So that's any other questions? What else can I hit? I wanted to make sure I touched on that.
Let's go to Mingus.
Let's say you can get the FHA loan and you put down 3%, and how do people avoid being house poor? Meaning, you don't want to just pay a mortgage and then not have enough money to buy groceries. Right? So how do you avoid that? So you can get a house, you can have this credit that you're talking about and this loan, but then you're putting down the 3%. But what if your mortgage is really, really high?
Right. Or interest rates are high, and so therefore your mortgage is high, which is what we're dealing with right now. It's a great question. And I think at the end of the day, you've got to do the math and you got to be realistic. You got to look at how much you make. You look at it from an after-tax perspective because that's what you have in your pocket every single month. And then you got to be realistic. How much do my groceries cost? How much does electricity? How much does my internet cost? How much does that extra video game every month cost? Whatever you're spending money on, right? The date, taking the lady out, taking the man out, whatever. Vacation once a year. You got to factor it all in. And you got to say, what is realistic for me to be able to pay for my house? So a great way to do it, you can cut through all of what I just said. And just, if you're paying rent today, the question is, whatever you're paying in rent, can you afford to pay it, or do you feel house poor? If you feel house poor, then if you don't want to be in that situation as a homeowner, then you're going to need to get a mortgage that nets out lower than what you're paying in rent today, which is possible, but that's what you got to shoot for. And then likewise, if you feel like, hey, I'm not really house poor right now, and I just want to make sure I don't get house poor by buying a house, then you got to think about that net payment that they're going to tell you would be due if you do the mortgage, and you got to say, okay, how much money do I have at the end of the month that I can afford to still put more into a house in order to live where I want to live? And you just got to be real with ourselves and make that right financial decision.